get better as we go on. So I think, can we get Deba on unmute and
not the only person with a mug.
No. Shh. Mug in hand. I'm hot water and lemon.
I'm doing a bit of advertising, LGBT Labour mug.
Branding, you're branding it.
Yes.
I don't know why that's not working.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute Deba. Aha. Unmute. Alex, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. That's great.
I made Debra a co-host so she can unmute herself. So
okay.
I think she's choosing not to unmute. But you're live on YouTube now, Jake. So you might want to.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
So whilst we wait for Deba, thank you so much everyone for joining. This is my first time ever hosting a panel discussion, so it's a nerve-wracking day, but I'm very glad it's here. I'm very glad we're doing it. It's an extremely important topic that we need to discuss. Obviously, the situation doesn't need much introduction. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and to my eye, at least, we're witnessing not only the rowing back on a lot of equality issues, but we're also seeing a lot of inequalities that were there before being exacerbated, and we're also seeing new inequalities form. And today we're just going to delve into some of those issues and assess the ways in which those inequalities are being exacerbated, created, and yeah. So have we made any progress on Deba? Let's have a look. Okay, so we're still waiting for Deba, but we'll start on some introductions. So today we've got with us Marta de Cordova. She's the MP for Battersea, as you can probably tell by her background. Very proudly Battersea. Apparently that
Absolutely.
apparently it's not your actual view. That is a Zoom background, right? Is that correct?
No.
So you've been recently appointed as the Shadow Equalities Women and Equality Secretary. Could you tell us just a bit more about what that's like and a bit more about you as well? That'd be great.
Do you want to know a bit more? So as you know, I got first elected as the MP for Battersea back in 2017, so not quite 3 years yet, just approaching that, and pretty quick into my time as an MP. I was appointed as the Shadow Minister for Disabled People, and my role there was based within the Department for Work and Shadow DWP team, and obviously I was focusing around social security and employment for disabled people. And then once leadership changed and we had elected a new leader last month, and I was pleased when Keir asked me if I would serve as the Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. And you know, I think it's just, for me, it's a great opportunity to really Labour is the party of equality and always has been, but really to focus in now on so many areas, whether it's disabled people's rights, but you know, women's rights, LGBTQ+, and also BAME communities as well. But I think what's really important is that what this pandemic has done, as you've already alluded to, is we don't want to see a rowing back of any of our rights that we've already secured. In fact, you know, I think we need to really step up the conversation about inequalities and, you know, how that affects us as a wider society.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marsha. We've also got Heather Peter here. She is the co-chair of LGBT plus Labour, and she very recently co-wrote the submission to the Women's Inequality Select Committee about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. And I think today is a really great meeting because there's a lot of crossover here, and there are loads of ways in which we can all work together to achieve some of those goals as you outlined in that. So Heather, if you could just speak a bit more about your experiences and what you've been doing recently, and you know the job.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll come on into the general discussions more about how inequalities through all the protected characteristics and poverty and other things that are not protected characteristics, but nevertheless an inequality in our society, add together to make this COVID crisis worse for those people affected.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of LGBT Labour's submission to the Select Committee, I mean, a couple of the things that we've really noticed over this period is, I'm sure for everyone, whatever your background, is quite hard to live either on your own or in a family 24/7. You know, with people you might love and might get on well with in normal times, but to be housed in there all the time is very, very difficult. And if you're a child or a teenager, or even young adults, like who's coming to terms with being LGBT or is exploring their identity, well, that's particularly hard being trapped at home there all the time, because, you know, it's one of those things whereby you might not be out at all to your family. Families vary in their acceptance, and you know, some members of the family might be accepting, others might make snide remarks, etc. That has got to be very, very difficult if you are stuck full time in that environment. And then for some people, and not everyone, and this is one of the inequalities that we have, some people do have internet access and can talk to their friends, but that's not as easy, not as easy as speaking in person. And again, sort of like not everyone has that, and that's one of the issues about poverty is additive to our inequalities, because if you can't have the internet access and the privacy of a room within a house to go to talk to people, that's going to be very difficult as well. And then for transgender people, that is very hard in lots of families, because often being transgender isn't accepted anyway, or people have come to terms, but come to terms with it on their own terms, if you like. So families have tried to suppress someone's expression of being transgender, or what they wear, or how they behave. And to be put in that environment 24/7, again, that's an immense toll on your mental health and pressure. There's not always intentional abuse. It does become a psychological abuse over time. And I think throughout sort of like our communities, we're seeing mental health is taking a massive, you know, this crisis is having a massive impact on our mental health. From the harassment angle, I mean, a lot of trans people and a lot of LGBT people use online forums to discuss things, but we have the dreaded trolls who come out and harass people. And that's very difficult for the trans community at the moment, because a lot of it depends on confidentiality. So you join a trans forum, okay, sort of like with the idea that you can discuss things that are quite personal to you. And, you know, the administrators, I forgot what you call them, but the forum managers, etc., can't really screen out who's a genuine trans person joining and who's a troll who's just trying to, you know, get on to find out things about people and disrupt things. So I think that's become a lot worse during the crisis. I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the future, but just one thing I'd like to say, because this government is not handling the crisis, in my opinion, very well. And one of the things they're not handling is not trusting the people and not trusting other groups to have frank discussions of how we get out of this. Okay, and one of the things that's going to, I suspect, happen is the LGBT societies, like or LGBT community, you know, we, like everyone, are missing going out on dates and hooking up with people, etc. Now, if you don't get that sensibly, if we don't have sensible discussions about how we can do that safely, how we can interface dating apps, hookup apps with contact tracing, then I think what you'll see is you'll start to see spikes again, particularly hitting minority communities like LGBT communities, because the government's got a one-size-fits-all attitude to this pandemic. You do need to have some adjustments. So sorry for whittling on, but I think those are
that's
some
great.
Development.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really great, Heather. We are now joined by Deepa Syed, who, are you there?
Yeah, am I unmuted now?
Hello, yes, thank you so much. Deepa Syed is a political activist. She's also a women's rights advocate and campaigner, and she is also a sexual harassment lawyer with Rights of Women. She did not found Rights of Women, as I incorrectly wrote. I am so embarrassed by that. But I'm sure if you were around, you would have.
Yeah, no, Rights of Women was founded in 1975 by much more extraordinary women. I just provide the new service, which is the sexual harassment advice line. But yeah, no, I want to say something more generally about we give free legal advice to women, and what we've seen over the last few weeks is a massive uptick in the amount of people who now need legal advice. We're a sexual harassment line, but it's becoming patently obvious that people need much more broader employment advice. And of course, if you're being discriminated against or harassed in the workplace, that is going to be, your options are dependent on the job market as a whole. So if you're in a harassment situation, you might not feel free to leave it because you don't know where your next job is coming from or where your next money is coming from. And just more generally, we've seen a huge amount of calls from women who are just generally feeling unsafe in the workplace, whether that is because they don't have adequate PPE or they are being subjected to increased levels of harassment or discrimination. And just to say, I could go on and on about legal aid, but, we've got a real problem here that the legal aid system was already, basically decimated. It pretty much doesn't exist for employment law anyway. Yeah. And now we're just, we're going to see a huge increase of people needing that support. So I just wanted to start with that. But more generally, the pandemic has highlighted entrenched gender issues that we, in the women's sector were well aware of already. But I am genuinely fearful that what I would call structural misogyny and racism and class inequalities will be only now further entrenched. And we have to recognise that we have a bad problem in the Labour Party where we segregate all sort of minorities apart from each other, and we say, right, you're the BME people and you're the women and you're LGBT. And the truth of the matter is, though, your issues will intensify or become more complex depending on what ever background you represent or come from. The more marginalized, if you're BME or a migrant worker or a refugee, or you have a disability, or you're a lone parent, or you're a sex worker, or whatever it is, all of those interplaying together will make it much more difficult for you to navigate this pandemic. So it's really important that we understand that when we're thinking about the pandemic. But more than that, we have to recognize when the government is making its response, we need to understand it as fact that women will be impacted differently than men in the crisis. And that is because women are much more likely to be on the front line. They are much more likely to be the healthcare and care workers on the front line. But also, we know that women do the lion's share when it comes to caring responsibilities anyway. So many women right now I know that are, as well as doing their jobs, they're also doing things like homeschooling, and they're expected to do so much unpaid care work as it already is. So I think in terms of financial response to this, you know, the economic fallout of the crisis, we need to be looking at, well, we need to start talking about care very in much more detail, and we need to start looking at unpaid care, because I'd like to see the government see this and understand it through a gendered lens and start providing primary caregivers resources and money, because what we're going to see now is we're in this period right now, we're just going through it, but when women start returning back to the workplace, we've got this furlough leave, okay, for a few weeks, a few months now, but what we're going to see is employers are going to, we're going to see a lot of redundancies, and we're going to see a lot of employers trying to reduce their workforce, and who will be bearing the brunt of that? It will be women. So there's that to think about. Just generally, I want to say more on the lack of planning when it came to this lockdown is kind of astonishing when it comes to women. So one of the first things that happened in the lockdown was women saying, you know, women who had scheduled abortions were having those abortions cancelled or being refused access to abortion pills, because we have a system where you have to get 2 doctors to sign off on abortions in this country. And now abortion and contraceptive access is absolutely fundamental to women's human rights, really. And what I'm worried about is that as we really relocate resources to coronavirus, of course, as we should, we have to be aware that we are not defunding these also, you know, vitally important services, which, you know, women have fought hard and hard for. So, and I think that sort of stems, something I read today in Italy, there is a campaign going to try and get more women on the scientific technical groups at the top of government planning, because this is critical, this is important, because this is why, you know, we've heard a lot about domestic abuse, rightly so, but I really struggle to think, I really do believe if there were some women in that room initially at the beginning, there would have been some consideration that if we enforce a lockdown, we're going to be putting women who are living with violent and controlling partners, living, you know, not just women, these are children as well. So it's not just women, it's small children as well, often, who will bear the brunt of domestic violence. And we know, you know, as many as 16 women and 2 children have died at the hands of violent partners already. And what we've seen is local councils have been given some instruction, okay, you know, we need to give housing to these women, and rightly so, and there are some new measures in the domestic abuse bill, long overdue. But we need to start seeing these in an interconnected way, because what we will find at the end of the lockdown, or even if we put some small money into these resources, that we're still going to see a rise in homelessness. And domestic abuse and homelessness are intertwined, because if you cannot flee your abuser, if you must flee your abuser, often these women are taking small children in tow with them. They are trying to seek temporary accommodation in places like refuges, which we know have been massively underfunded over the last 10 years. They are turning 60% of women away already. So I'd like to see a more interconnected response that understands that. And, you know, there's been some measures in the domestic abuse bill, but it doesn't go far enough. And don't even get me started on how it doesn't address issues specifically related to migrant women.
Yeah.
Sorry, am I going on too much?
No, not at all. No, I was just agreeing. No, not at all. No, thank you very much.
You will just wave at me if I need to shut up. I mean, there's just one more thing. I mean, 2 more things I want to say on discrimination more generally. So in my work, well, what we've seen, I've got some interesting calls actually from women who have disabilities, and they are really fearful on how social distancing, let's say when we return to whatever normal is now, but things like social distancing are going to have, you know, particular impact on people with disabilities who rely on contact to get about their daily business or whatever. So we need to do some consideration for that.
Just on that point, could I bring in Marsha on that, just because I think she'll. Do you have something you want to say on that, Marsha?
No, well, I think when we're going to talk about disabled people in the context of COVID, I think we would absolutely all agree that they are a group that has been impacted quite negatively. And if we just start thinking about it, whether it's around access to social care and their care, which I can go into a bit more detail on, or accessing social security, and the fact that social security levels have remained the same if you're a disabled person, but for others the government chose to uprate it. But also, just to pick up on what Deepa was just saying, in terms of social distancing, it is pretty difficult for a lot of ill and disabled people to be able to practice that. For example, if you're blind, it would be incredibly challenging for you to do that. And a recent ONS survey found that 9 in 10 disabled adults have expressed their concerns about the effect of the pandemic is having on them, and their inability to actually be able to practice social distancing. But the issues that disabled people face are so much broader than that, because the way when the government first started planning around COVID, they set out what's called the government shielding list for vulnerable people, and that list only included 1.5 million ill and disabled people, obviously leaving out millions of disabled people. But the impact of that shielding list is that is the list that employers are now using to determine whether or not you're vulnerable. It's a list that local authorities are using, and more importantly, the evidence suggests that supermarkets have also been using this list, and that has resulted in thousands of disabled people not being able to basically access groceries and basically be able to access food deliveries, which is, everybody needs to eat. If you can't go to a supermarket, but you can't access an online grocery, where does that leave you? And if you're relying on your carers to do it for you, you're placing yourself at a great risk around social distancing, and also they're putting them at risk as well. I won't even go into the issues around adequate PPE, but that is also, that plays out not just in the NHS or in care homes, it plays out in social care quite deeply as well as also for domiciliary or home care also.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask the panel. I guess you could call this the first question. And by the way, people watching, please feel free to type questions in the chat if you do have anything to ask. A lot of the way in which we talk about preparedness for the pandemic, we often talk about lockdown and social distancing. That's the kind of most obvious way in which the government could have responded better. But to what degree does the government kind of not know its own population? Like, how many of the problems that are coming up are due to the fact that not enough resources have been spent on establishing the needs of the population, and the nuances that are in there? So if we could start with Marsha, and we'll go through to Heather and then Deepa, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks. I think, it's important to start by saying that what the pandemic has done, COVID has basically exposed and amplified some of those inequalities and injustices. And that's resulted, as we've already pointed out, that it's had such a disproportionate impact on certain groups. And, we haven't covered BAME groups, so I am going to kind of touch on it now. But when we think about the scale of COVID on our BAME communities, it is quite shocking. And, we know that some BAME groups are susceptible to health conditions like, diabetes, cancer, and so forth. But the overrepresentation in the number of COVID deaths, as we saw this week with the ONS figures, if you are Black, African, or Caribbean man or woman, you are four times more likely to die from this than your white counterparts. Now, this is then born through in other aspects. So if you think about it in the context of employment and key workers, and particularly our NHS and social care workers, we've seen that played out quite extensively, where the deaths of workers within the health sector is disproportionately higher to that of any other group. And, you know, we can look at factors like the lack of protective equipment, or the fact that, you know, there's the issue around them being pushed more to the front line to do their work. I think now, when you have Public Health England, rightly so, saying that, you know, NHS trusts now need to risk assess its BAME frontline staff in relation to this crisis, it begs the question, why wasn't this thinking borne out before? And also, you know, we are relying on, you know, data from whether it's the ONS, where we're using census data to really help us recognise the scale of the crisis. But because you're seeing the evidence suggest to you that there are, you know, BME groups are disproportionately being more affected by this, we all know there's the health issue, but there is also the economic and social inequalities. And until we start to have that conversation and that discussion, quite frankly, about those structural inequalities, it's going to be really difficult to kind of move forward, because already in this crisis, what you're finding is that some groups are going to face, you know, huge amounts of financial uncertainty, particularly if you're already working in those shutdown industries. So, you know, it goes back to the question, you know, even when the government were formulating their policies, when they were passing emergency legislation, you know, they would have done their own equalities impact assessments, but they won't publish that information. Why won't they publish that information? Because we all know it's going to be stark. But at least having the information in the domain, that helps us to start planning and thinking about how we move forward post this crisis. And so I think the government's failures in terms of really assessing the risks and the impact on protected groups, particularly, you know, our BAME, women, LGBTQ+, and disabled people, they have fallen quite short in this, and we're seeing that borne out. And I suppose it's really important for us in our thinking is how do we begin that dialogue to make sure, you know, this can't happen and doesn't happen again, because we know that the economics of this will mean, you know, we could potentially see masses, huge numbers in terms of unemployment, and, you know, the groups that potentially are going to be disproportionately affected by that will be disabled people, because they already are. And then you're going to have, you know, BNE people and other groups. And we also have to look at how that all interacts and intersects, because you can also be, you know, a woman, but you can be a disabled woman. So it's those additional layers, and it's how we really look at the solutions and what we need structurally, what needs to change to ensure that it's not going to exacerbate more than it should.
Thank you. Thank you, Marsha. I did notice, I did notice that the Runnymede Trust published a report called The Colour of Money, and found that, you know, when you look at the graph, which maybe I could share in a moment once I find it, that, you know, across racial lines, you know, economic equality is so stark. And it, to me anyway, it seems that a lot of individuals' issues when it comes to the coronavirus is rooted somewhat in wealth and in assets. You know, the asset rich are far less likely to be affected by a multitude of issues that the coronavirus can tease out. So like Heather and Deba, if we start with Heather, how in your experience and from what you've seen, has that been the case? How have those economic inequalities been passed?
Yeah, so I think intuitively it's pretty obvious that if you come from a poorer economic background, you're going to find this to be this crisis to have a more severe impact upon you. And I'd just like to give an example of sort of like the additive effects, because I think this is important when we look at the the sort of data, or when we try to get information from the data. So the additive effects of being poor. So if you've got two frontline workers, one is from an affluent background or affluent family, and the other is you know, from a poor background. Okay, well, the person who returns home from the poor background will probably return home in an overcrowded house with perhaps an intergenerational, several generations within that house. So they are more likely to spread it to other members of their families. They haven't got individual rooms to go off and be separate from. So that, and also they're affecting perhaps older relatives or mothers and fathers, etc., who are living under the same roof. So that's one part of this social inequality, which particularly affects the BME community, but it also affects the disabled community and lots of other minorities as well. But then we've got the second part of this, which is the health inequality that builds up over a long period of time. If you're from a poor background, okay, you will often have health problems accumulate because, you know, basically, you know, living in poverty is not good for your health. I mean, it can be the environmental impact, it can be lack of access to medical treatment. Even though we have the NHS, which is free, that doesn't necessarily mean it's used fully and as well in sort of like some of the more poor communities. So therefore, you're more likely to have within those families long-term illnesses, might be uncontrolled diabetes, might be cardiovascular diseases that will lead to your death. So, or more likely to cause death in or contribute to the death in coronavirus cases. So I think it's not surprising that the data has come back and shown that actually the BME community is disproportionately hit in terms of deaths by the COVID crisis. Just on your original point, which was about how little the government knows about its own communities. Well, I'd say one of the things there has been a long time in its making. It's been the cutting back of local government finances, because let's face it, local government knows their local community, okay? And you know, when you've cut that back over a period of 10 years, then it's not surprising that the tools that you have, A, to know your community, but B, to remedy issues that come up within that community, have been massively impacted upon. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to add that as a point in terms of knowing your communities.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Yeah, Deepa, would you like to come in on that? How do you see the impact of the government's ability to know its population, to communicate with the population, and particularly in the context of women and sexual harassment?
You know what, I don't accept for a single second that the government could not have foreseen any of this and that the data isn't there. I think if you look at other crises, if you look at conflicts, you know, war, we see these things happen again and again. You know, gender-based violence always increases in conflict. We know that. We know that from Ebola. We know that from Zika. We know that from human history. The problem with addressing the domestic abuse issue specifically, which was already outrageously high and had been for years, you know, 2 women dying a week from a partner or ex-partner. It was already, you know, very, very high. But the problem was, and the problem still is that there wasn't, if you want to fix a problem, you've got to put money and resource towards it. The women's sector have been crying out for ring-fenced funding to fix this problem. Yet it's come to a negotiation 70 million is going into a fund, right? It's a drop in the ocean. It is a drop in the ocean compared to what is necessary to fix the problem. And I think that just, you know, and that's only, I'm only talking about violence against women there. That is, you've seen a very different approach. So you take, say, look, Sadiq Khan, he said straight away, we're going to make flats available for women who are fleeing domestic violence for their children. We're going to make it happen. You could roll that out nationally, but the Home Office don't want to do it. And I think the problem there is more political will. And what we've seen is, the Women's Inequality Select Committee opened up an inquiry. How is this going to impact? We've got a government inquiry about BME deaths. Well, all of those organisations, including mine, are just cobbling together what we've been shouting out for years, which was structural inequality is there. Here's all the data to prove it. But I think, the problem is the political will, as always.
I think that really points out the something that is a real deep gripe of mine, which is when people ask you to not politicize things. And the issue is that this is deeply political, because political choices are made which have direct impacts on people, and particularly at the level of government, where people are kind of making, where government's essentially making paintbrush one size fits all choices, and to the public's dismay, or actually people coming in, people are diverse, and that obviously doesn't work. And I think what the left and Labour have to work out are ways in which to communicate that to the public, that are going to get people on side, but also kind of waking people up to the fact that political choices are being made. So Marsha, as an MP, as a frontbencher, how do you go about that? How do you go about politicizing and making people care about those issues?
Well, look, Jake, you're right. It's political choices. It's and whoever's in government, they therefore have the power to implement whatever policies they choose to do, and generally, usually, it's going to disproportionately affect another group. And if you think about this pandemic happened, and one of the first things the Minister for Women and Equalities did was suspend the gender pay equity. Now, that is something that is so important. I mean, to suspend it for the rest of this year without any idea as to when they're going to be reinstating it, that's a choice, right? And so what can be the impact of that? We can see the rowing back of, pay equality for women, when we already know the gender pay gap is far too wide as it is, hence why we need reporting. But it's the political choices that they make have consequences. And that is what we have to do. The choices that having a lack of PPE for our care workers will have consequences. We are seeing the death rate rise within those settings. And so it's really important for us as on the left and obviously, as our movement more widely, it's about how we can make sure we are, which I think we're starting to do, really shape what we want to say in a way that, we have to bring the public alongside us. We have to ensure the public fully understand that certain political choices will have a consequence and they will negatively impact X. When you think about, if we just talk a bit about some of the health inequality and the lack of public health information, if it's not reaching those groups that probably don't have access to get the information in the more traditional ways, of course they're not going to be able to manage their diabetes better. Of course they're not going to be, do you understand what I'm saying? And yeah. It's all of those choices. I mean, look, this is a slightly off the piece, but if we think about the way the government have been handling their daily press briefings, which, I wish that we were having those daily statements in Parliament, frankly. Mm-hmm. But, they have these briefings and they are supposed to be for the public. But if you're deaf and you don't have the BBC News channel or you don't have access to the internet, you can't just watch those daily press briefings because there's no sign language interpretation. Yeah. Now, those are choices because you call on them to do it. The EHRC have now called on them to get their act together to actually make sure, that if you are deaf, you can access public health information in whatever format you need to. You can't, their choices, their policies are actually restricting access. That can't be right. And it's how you make sure we try to, at the moment, we have to try and influence and bring them on that journey, which I think we are trying to do, we are starting to do, but also there has to be the political will. You know, we're going to hear an announcement tomorrow from the Prime Minister, and, you know, many people are very worried about the lifting of lockdown, particularly if you're from a BAME community, because, you know, you're already at a greater risk of you know, falling foul to the virus.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would kind of, whilst we're on this kind of topic, I'd like to bring in a question from Tess Milligan. We'll start with Deba. So she asked, finding this discussion very insightful, thanks. Would I be able to ask a question about how to tackle inequality in education, which has been exacerbated by the lockdown? You know, there are many ways in which, as activists, as professionals, we try and educate people on things, on issues we care about. Of course, there's governmental education that we need to take into account, but Deba, how has education been impacted, or the ways in which you might educate, how has that been impacted by the coronavirus?
Are you talking about education as in the education system, or education about inequality? I'm a bit confused.
In education about, I mean, either, but education about inequality. If
I will say something on that, because I'm going to use this opportunity to plug a campaign I'm working on. So look, I mean, so look, I mean, inequality, we're talking about it, this is great, but when you're actually discriminated or harassed in the workplace, right, it kind of all falls onto you to go and enact your rights. No, everything is in favor of the employer. There is nothing to stop an employer discriminating against somebody. All the system works that if you've been discriminated against, you have to go and find justice, okay? And what we see now, I'm very concerned about what I'm seeing in my work, is the government now, I mean, nobody would have seen this, but ACAS, which is the organisation which sort of regulates employers, have just published guidance basically saying to employers, look, we know things are tough. If some, you know, discrimination and harassment goes on, you know, basically, if you can investigate it, that would be great, but, you know, we get it. So basically, the employers have just been given a massive leeway now, you know, complete carte blanche to say, oh, you know, we can't really run a proper show right now because of the virus. And what I'm very worried about is in the Equality Act, right? One of the proudest achievements we have from the last Labour government. You have 3 months to enact your rights. So you only have 3 months to do that. Otherwise, so I mean, I have to do this all the time when women come and, you know, it's been 5 months after they've been sexually harassed, and I have to go, well, sorry, because it has to be done in 3 months. So, I mean, I think that's something that we need to be educated about, and other people need to understand, because I think a lot of people, once it's happened to them and they have to go and learn the system for the first time themselves, they're often horrified to realize that the system is deeply unfair, that they won't get funded for it. They have to be rich enough to basically get access to all the employment rights that they think they have to them. So do support on Monday, we're doing a petition to get the 3-month time limit extended as an emergency measure under the pandemic, to give people more time who have been discriminated against to pursue it in the courts.
Brilliant.
So yeah.
Thank you, Deba. Yeah, Heather, would you want to come in on that?
I see the question came up and said it was talking about schools, so I will just go back to the school point. But I think it's very important just to support what Deba was saying there about the 3-month rule and enforcing your rights, because there's no point, well, there is a point to having employment rights, but if they're not enforceable, you know, they're more something to make politicians feel better rather than actually making a difference in the world. Just on the schooling and education, I mean, one of the big problems is that, you know, there's lots of lessons out there on the internet, and the BBC are trying to do their CBBC sort of, you know, bite-sized information. That's all very good, provided you can afford to have the internet, you've got rooms in which children can work, etc. And you've got the television stations and a television in that room for the children to use. There's a huge number of families who do not have those options. And so we are already impacting on those people. I know there were schemes to try to make computers available, etc., but they haven't responded to the actual need that there is in this COVID crisis. Even if you did make a computer available, does that family actually have the internet access? Would you actually have the space to work alone? And I was on a Zoom meeting the other day with a head teacher who was saying one of the troubles is that you know, we also don't have the safeguarding that we used to have of children attending schools. So, you know, if a child attends a school, the teachers will often pick up, not always, but will often pick up that there's a problem in the family that's leading to emotional or physical abuse. That isn't happening now. Okay, the teachers want to phone in and speak to the child, and they're doing a tremendous job on that. But it's very hard for that child to say anything as well if there's a problem at home. So I don't know what the solution is, to be honest. I think I will plug for when it comes on that we did do this Zoom broadcast of inclusive sex and relationship education, which spoke a bit more in general about education as well. When that goes out, it is on YouTube. I will make sure that I send the links, because some of the head teachers and people in education had some good points. But I think it's very difficult to know how you tackle inequalities in schools given this crisis, because the government hasn't put the resources in already. And when you're in a crisis, it's the worst time to try and solve problems, isn't it? Sort of like, you know, so yeah, that's what I'd say.
That's great. Thank you, Heather. Marsha, would you be able to come in on specifically on the education system and how kind of holes in that system have exacerbated?
Well, the holes in the system are there because of 10 years of austerity and cuts, you know, and that's the government have chosen, again, made the choice not to invest in our local schools. If I just think about my schools in Battersea alone, they lost 12 million, you know, over the last few years. So that's a lot of money and resource. And you know, for those who don't know my constituency, there are parts of it that's quite affluent. I mean, but then there are parts where there is high deprivation. So, you know, my schools need investment. But what this crisis has done is, again, we keep saying it, it's exacerbated the inequality, but it really has done so, because what we're finding now, and we've had to do local campaigns and stuff, because is, you know, a lot of children do not have access to the internet at home. Digital exclusion is a huge problem, and I've spoken about this previously, because even if you don't have access to the internet and you're just relying on your phone data, you hear of families choosing whether to actually, you know, making difficult choices about whether to top up their phone so their child can do their homework or do their schoolwork, or, you know, buy essentials for the home. No one should be placed in that situation or faced with those difficult choices. But if we begin to think more so about older children, so those that are, you know, in year 10s and 11s, this is a really crucial time for them. And, you know, them not having that school classroom setting and learning, and have to do that remotely, particularly if you're living in a home that's overcrowded, or, you know, your parents are key workers, so they're not at home, it's going to make it, well, those children can actually go to school, but, you know, it's going to make it difficult for those children to learn. And then we're in a situation now where GCSEs and so forth, all of those grades are going to be just predicted. And, you know, teachers are going to have to make those choices and decisions about that child's future. No, I don't think that's the best way to go. Whether the government produces adequate guidance or not, it's always going to be quite subjective, because you're basically relying on an individual to make that choice. But more importantly, children, a lot of the young people, they are missing out on actually having that final push by sitting an exam to maybe bump up that grade. And then you've got the added issue about whether they want to go into further or higher education, and whether or not those grades will then be met to give them the entry to do so. So I think the issues around education, particularly as part of this pandemic, is probably one of the starkest, because our children and our young people, as cliche as this sounds, these are crucial times for them, and it's about them and their future. And the difficulties that schools, head teachers and teachers being kind of delegated to make these decisions, will potentially have a disproportionate impact if you're a poorer child, or if you're from a Black, Asian, or other minority ethnic group. So this sounds really depressing, but these are really challenging times if you think about the impact on our young people and education.
Yeah. Staying with you, Marsha, I just wanted to ask you a question on behalf of Charlie Kane, who asked, I wanted to ask a question about LGBT rights. The UN recently warned governments not to use Corona as a cover for rolling back LGBT rights, LGBT plus rights, with a concern most over Hungary, which first act after seizing complete control was to deny trans people their rights. Recently, Liz Truss announced that the government would seek to restrict young trans people's access to transition healthcare. So what have you been doing on the you and the front bench have been doing on that issue specifically?
Well, I think we've got a proud history of LGBT plus and trans rights in the Labour Party, and I'm really proud of that history, and I'm proud to support all that work. And Liz Truss made those comments, which I wrote to her privately about straight away, actually, because there can be no rowing back on anyone's rights, and especially on trans rights. And so it's really important going forward that I'm hoping that the government does finally respond to the consultation on the Gender Recognition Act, so that we can actually begin to start working towards bringing about true and meaningful equality for all people, and that includes people that are trans. Yeah.
Heather, would you like to come in on that, specifically about like international concerns as well?
Yeah, I certainly will come on to international ones. In terms of Liz Truss, I mean, she has always been a conservative that has banged the drum for her own sort of like part of the Conservative Party. And she is one of those examples, again, of using a crisis to announce something on a select committee to get some headlines quickly in the Daily Mail and the Sunday Times or the Times, etc., to appease that element of the Conservative Party, and again be completely misinformed. I mean, on the treatment of people under the age of 18 for gender dysphoria and having hormone puberty blockers and potentially hormone treatment. Okay, she is so uninformed. Actually, what the puberty blockers are doing is for a small number of children that are actually referred to this gender clinic, and this is thought to be, with a lot of discussion, and they're very conservative, so small c conservative in their attitudes, these gender clinics. If that is thought to be the best way to help that child through a very difficult period and give them more time to think about their decisions, then puberty blocking is the best way forward. Okay, so actually just to be, and there is a court case going on about this at the moment, so Liz Truss really shouldn't be trying to preempt a court case listening to some expert evidence. So all round, I think her statement there was pretty poor for lots of reasons, not just factual reasons, but just in terms of just the way to handle it. Again, her talk about sort of like saying, oh, women need to be safe in safe spaces yes, there are transgender women who are being beaten up and sexually assaulted all the time. They need to be safe. Okay, this it's another one of those examples of whereby the Conservatives in particular try to divide minorities and try and divide discriminated against groups to be one against another, okay, rather than all accept that actually we're all in this together. Okay, if someone is harassing other women, okay, if they're harassing cis women, they're going to harass trans women. You know, if they harass trans women, they really want to harass cis women too. Okay, so let's make sure that we apply equality to all equalities and protect transgender rights. The international situation with Viktor Orban is worrying. It's been worrying in Hungary for a long time to have such an authoritarian leader in a so-called democracy in Europe. And I mean, what they're proposing is to take away, to define sex at birth and never to allow that to be changed, and a series of other campaigns. And I totally say that we've got to unite against Hungary's in this example, but there's been LGBT attacks on LGBT rights in Poland and elsewhere. So right on our doorstep in Europe, as well as further afield, we've got to stand in solidarity. Labour have got to reappoint, and I'm not sure if they have or if they're going to reappoint an international envoy for LGBT rights, and make sure that we do that when we eventually elect a Labour government to actually be a government person as well. And I totally support the Rainbow Rose campaign on Drop 33, I think that is, which is a section of the bill relating to gender recognition of trans people. Perhaps we'll put that up afterwards on the Open Labour account. And,
absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you. And Adiba, how is the international? What is the international situation?
Oh yeah, so I want to make a So I think I read I echo everything you both have said 100%, and just make the sort of broader point that the Equality Act is woeful when it comes to gender rights, transgender rights anyway. Yeah. So the job was not done in 2010. A whole piece of work needs to be done to update it. The language is all, embarrassingly out of date, and there are specific issues about harassment, particularly, that need to be addressed and updated. So a big job for the Labour Party to be having proper policy on anyway. I just want to make just to broaden it out from trans rights. I read an article today in the Telegraph where a very senior government lawyer is calling for the UK to withdraw from different international human rights law under the pandemic, so that we, have these emergency measures. You would have seen, I'm sure, that really shocking video from the Manchester police of that incident of complete police brutality, and we've got to have a think about what kind of, we have to think about our civil liberties and general protections for minorities and equalities legislation, because we have seen a rise in police brutality and misuse of power, and those international laws are there to protect us from that, and it's something that we haven't really thought about, I think, in terms of our response. So I think I'd like to see us on the front foot about that, and sort of just be aware of these issues. And
absolutely,
yeah,
I think you make a great point about policing in particular, and I think if we're all on the plugging, I'll plug Socialists of Colour and the 1987 caucus, because those two organisations are working.
Say that again. I didn't hear. Say that again.
I'll plug the Socialists of Colour on Twitter and the 1987 caucus. They're both doing so much work on trying to expose those inequalities, particularly on policing, which disproportionately affects Black men as well. And I kind of want to use that to segue into our next section, which is kind of like social inequalities. I think something that a lot of people might have also noticed that was pointed out by Yasmin Nasli on Twitter really well was that how different communities are policed, and Muslims have been given very strong and strict messaging about staying home for Ramadan, which is still 2 weeks away. Yet on VE Day, the streets were littered with people having street parties and breaking social distancing. So I want to ask the panel, like, how does the way in which, you know, the government enforces social distancing, how has that affected minority communities and LGBT and women as well? I should do my job and say if we start with Deba.
I mean, I think that is, I think that's just the accumulation of everything we've already discussed, but it is another example of structural racism, especially in the police. And yeah, I think we need to do something about this once and for all. I think, you know, we could go on and on about, we know structural racism exists, but what are the actual measures we're going to take to ensure that the police are doing more on this? So I know, you know, this goes to the heart of my work as well, which is in sexual violence, and there's also, you know, discrimination and these kinds of things. I mean, I think actually our police are deeply underprepared or not sufficiently able to do their jobs, and we need to perhaps completely overhaul the way that they are trained or the way that they interpret legislation. It seems really, really inadequate, and I'm sure that is linked to do with cuts and things like that as well. But the only thing I hope we can do after this pandemic is over is build some kind of new public services which are better and more understanding of the actual challenges that we face, and pour money into the things. If we actually want to see inequality change, it's all of these intangible things that we need to do. So it's things like training the police and working with the police to understand how they are interacting with different minority groups.
That's great, thank you. And Heather, how does the way in which, particularly, I'm concerned about LGBT plus spaces, right? And the lack of funding for those, and the coronavirus piled on top of that. How has that affected the community in the sense of accessing spaces and each other?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the things that we have actually put in our submissions to the select committee, because one of the issues for the LGBT community, it's about 8% of the population identifies as LGBT plus, and so what we find is a lot of our venues, quite naturally, are in urban hubs. Okay, perhaps too many in the urban hubs, small towns left out, but for the moment, just saying that it's more in urban areas. Those are also the places that are being most affected by high rents, needing to be paid when a business isn't functional. Okay, so a lot of our LGBT community centres, hubs, clubs will go out of business, and that will be disproportionately impacting on LGBT those LGBT businesses. But they also fulfill, as well as a commercial thing and for socializing, they also fulfill a lot more than that. Okay, they are the spaces where you can give out, you know, free sexual health, you know, barrier methods, contraception, which is very important. It's also areas where you can help people, you know, if you're focusing on mental health or other campaigns, etc. So those spaces are really, really important, and they have been, or they will be, disproportionately impacted by this coronavirus. Going back in terms of what's happening at the moment, whilst we're all having to social distance, well, I think I said earlier that there are LGBT forums, particularly in the transgender community, but elsewhere as well. And those are you know, suffer a lot of attacks, if you like, and abuse being thrown at people over the internet, whereas where that is our only social mechanism at the moment of interacting with people and providing support. And we've long been a poor relation, the LGBT community, in terms of our rights and what is considered abuse online. Okay, so things that you wouldn't tolerate if it was said about women or another group, etc., seem to be almost, oh, well, that's freedom of speech if you want to attack the LGBT community, etc. I mean, there are nasty people out there attacking all minorities and attacking women as well, but it seems to be a disproportionate, you know, it's almost accepted by the media and by governments that you can throw abuse at individuals. We're not just talking about, you know, an issue of debate. You can now almost find someone and go, oh, you look like you're trans, throw lots of abuse at that person, and that's not considered harassment or not considered an online crime, etc. So things do need to be tackled. And I would have said that actually in this crisis, was the time of which a government which was really thinking would say, look, actually, we really do need to tackle internet abuse. Okay, that is not accepted wherever it's targeted, because it's causing an overwhelming impact on our mental health of those communities. And if you like, it's a double whammy. You've got twice as many trolls out there now because people aren't going out to do other things. So they're keyboard warriors having a go at people online. And, you know, there's all that other impact on our mental health of being locked down for so long. So really, they should have used this as an emergency to actually say, no, we've got to be tighter on these regulations. And as far as I can see, they haven't. I would say that.
That's true. Thank you. Marsha, how, in particular for the disabled community, how has things like Dora's asked a quite a good question about how PPE has actually affected disabled people. For example, people wearing face masks is affecting deaf people, and also like how can we change our like attitude to accessibility and enshrine that in equality law? Is that possible as well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I think it is possible, and I'm choosing to go with it has to be possible. We've got to make it possible, and if there's political will to do that, then it can happen. I believe, and the Labour Party's position is, we believe in the social model of disability, and I think that's one of the first hurdles into achieving equality. And what that means is it's not your actual impairment that disables you, it is society that disables you. So, you know, having an inaccessible transport network, for instance, prevents a disabled person from being, you know, traveling to work and being independent. And if we can start to tackle some of those injustices, those societal injustices that exist, then actually we'll start to see a more equal and accessible world for disabled people. And that's why I am a strong advocate for, and I believe in, what is called the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, because it talks about and it tackles all of those structural inequalities, whether that's in, you know, having a fully inclusive education system, whether that's making sure that labour laws and employment rights are fully, you know, incorporated for disabled people, or having access to independent living. We already know that there's a crisis in social care, and there has been for the last decade, or frankly longer. But again, during this pandemic and this crisis, you know, it's gotten even worse. When you have the emergency legislation that was passed, I said this earlier, you know, that effectively allowed local authorities to suspend their duties under the Care Act to provide social care or independent living for a disabled person. That was, you know, I oppose that obviously personally, but that was something that has happened. And we have to make sure that, you know, to fully comply with the UN Convention, which we signed up to as a Labour government back in 2009, I should point out. But this government has done nothing to really actually fully incorporate that into domestic legislation. And until we start to do that, then we're not going to see the rights of disabled people fully incorporated. Even the language that we use, you know, using the term, you know, people with disabilities, we're kind of hearkening to the medical model, which the medical model is there for a purpose, but it really shouldn't define how we as a society develop and implement policies and structures for disabled people. On the issue of PPE, so there's several factors here. So we know there's a crisis with actually having access to PPE, but also, you know, the inaccessible function. If you have a face mask on, how do you communicate with somebody that is deaf? So there has to be alternative forms of PPE so that, you know, you're not breaking down that barrier to communicate with the person that you're around. So, you know, there are so many factors here, and it goes back to, and I say this, and I stress this, and I call on the government to do this in all its planning, you know, especially when it's talking about its recovery planning, and, you know, as we move forward, unless they really place disabled people and all groups really, you know, that would be have been disproportionately affected by this crisis, by this pandemic, then, you know, we're not going to see the rights of disabled people upheld, enhanced and improved. We're not going to see a reduction in the level of, you know, stop and search amongst our young Black men. You know, during this time, I mean, if we start to look at some of the statistics around, you know, what's happening in terms of fixed penalty notices being given, and also the numbers of people that are being stopped and searched, or just in the way the police, you know, enforce or actually enforcing the measures around social distancing, how they would communicate with one group might be very different to how they would do so with another group. And so I would say, put a call out to yourself, Jake, if you know, Socialists of Colour and the 1987 caucus, is it? Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And I'm guessing that comes from the fact that 1987 was historic when we elected 4 Black MPs. Is that right? I like that. That's
I'm glad you like it.
I do. And what I'm going to put a call out to you guys. You know, you really need to communicate and talk to me about some of the issues that are coming up, because unless, you know, it's fed in, we don't hear about it from on the ground.
Absolutely.
So Socialists for Colour and the 87.
That's work for me to do, right? That's why Sunday gone. But I would just want to. I'm a bit conscious of time, and I kind of want to kind of try and tie this into slightly like current affairs. A lot of what we've spoken about, as we've discussed, does boil down to assets, and it does boil down to wealth for a lot of different inequalities out there. Recently, we've been the Labour Party has been kind of embroiled in a bit of controversy regarding renters' rights, and I want to ask the panel how in which those inequalities, those economic equalities, are affecting renters, and the ways in which Labour can and should be helping them, and your opinions on that. Can we start with Heather? I'd specifically, Heather, I'd really like to know, because obviously for LGBT plus individuals, housing and homes is a really serious issue, and there's a lot of intertwining with housing and LGBT plus issues. So if you could come in on that, that'd be great.
So first on the general thing, I think in my mind, it's a no-brainer. There should be, the government should have taken action on rents right at the very beginning, okay? Because you don't want to give, okay? We've already got significant wealth inequality in this country, whereby the wealth, if you like, whether you own properties, large properties, etc., compared to the income, there is a big differentiation. And in this crisis, what we see is everyone might have lost their jobs or be on 80% wages, furloughed, or have a cap on their wages, but the same hasn't applied to rents. Okay, or government policy hasn't applied that to rents, whether that be on businesses or whether that be on tenants. And to be frank, it should have come into legal force right at the very beginning that actually the landlords and those who own the properties had to bear some of the impact of this crisis. So I think it would be perfectly sensible to bring in some form of rent controls and making sure that the actual sort of like landlords didn't take lots of money when people are not receiving income. In terms of LGBT issues, I mean, you're quite right. There is a big crisis for LGBT people in homelessness. That applied beforehand, okay? There would be lots of young LGBT people who are homeless because they couldn't go back to their families. They might have been staying with their families, but for reasons that came up, you know, discrimination, harassment within the family, being kicked out of home, etc. They couldn't stay. That's going to be a lot worse at the end of this crisis, because as I think I said at the beginning, you know, there will be lots of kids at home and teenagers at home, young people at home, who are, you know, LGBT, finding it very difficult to either not come out to their family or to manage being with a family that's got some homophobic, biphobic or transphobic people within it. And I suspect at the end of it, end of the lockdown, things are going to break down and people will become more homeless. So yeah, there needs to be action on that. So Deba said right at the very beginning, sort of like the problems with domestic violence, etc., is because of the lack of housing. Well, not because of the lack of housing, but one of the many solutions where you need to get away from those families, they're not there because the refuges are underfunded. Again, the cuts in government grants to local authorities has had an impact on that, but also the lack of housing means that actually a lot more tighter controls and a lot more excuses of why someone won't be rehoused or, you know, allowed a house where they need to get away from their partner. And the same will apply with LGBT abuse. I don't know what the answer is because it takes a while to build the homes, but I think, you know, you can use emergencies to actually say, look, you know, there shouldn't be empty properties at the moment. If there are empty properties, you know, let's commandeer those for the future, etc. So,
and
yeah,
thank you, Heather. And Deba, and I think the access to housing point is really important. How does that relate to women and
well,
not only access to housing, but just the ability to enter rented properties, to leave rented properties?
Well, okay, so the first thing to say in terms of women and the coronavirus specifically, one of the first things that the women's sector did, there is this amazing organization called the Southall Black Sisters. You should follow them. And they are amazing. And one of the first things they did was they went round to all the hotel chains and had negotiations with them. And they said, look, we need to source this emergency housing. And the hotel chains were on board, you know, they were ready to sign, but they wanted money from the government to underwrite it, to basically insure them. Yeah. And they came with, you know, a proposal pretty much on a plate, and Priti Patel in the Home Office, you know, they didn't even seriously engage with it at all. And that's, you know, it's painful when you don't, you know, the sector, when a sector is advising you on something, you should absolutely listen to it. There's some more general points to make about housing in terms of the priority access that's been given in the domestic abuse bill. The devil will be in the detail, because some of that will rely on doing legal checks, and legal checks could be things like making sure they have a connection to the area, or sometimes that can be checking their immigration status. And if you are a BME woman and you don't have, you might be an undocumented person, but you're in an abusive situation, you are then much less likely to go and seek these public services, you know, access refuges, access support, because this is something that abusers use all the time. They will use immigration status against somebody as a matter of controlling them, or they will threaten them with deportation or whatever it may be. So that is just a more general point about removing the hostile environment generally, but the issue of no recourse to public funds is a massive barrier in terms of, you know, what is essentially a human right, which is access to housing. So I would say that is the most prevalent thing to say in terms of an emergency response to the COVID crisis. But, you know, I think, you know, there is going to be a huge problem as well with people being in debt. So that has to be addressed as well. And I think it's right that we're coming out and talking about this, but we need to make sure that we are talking to the right people who understand the situation and the sector best.
Thank you. Thank you, Diba. We'll end with you, Marsha. I just wanted to ask you about, I don't know if you've seen today, but a Open Labour activist named Will Sorensen created a petition which opposes the current position on the way in which Labour are approaching like renters issues. And you know, given that economic inequalities are being exacerbated by the coronavirus, what do you think is the right way forward in terms of approaching renters' rights issues and protecting renters?
Well, I haven't seen the petition, so thanks for the heads up that there is one. I mean, obviously, yeah, you know, Labour has come up with their 5-point housing, have come up with a 5-point plan for this pandemic and housing. I think, you know, we are in the housing crisis has been here for a long time, and again, we are now in a situation where it's just going to be exacerbated. And when we think about renters, they are the ones that are being hit quite hard with this area. And I think more so about what I have a lot of empathy, and that is private renters. I have one of the, you know, it's probably the most transient, one of the most transient constituencies, but also full of young renters. I think we're the second highest in the country. And so it's really about ensuring, you know, that particularly for those that potentially going to end up not being in work and will then have to be reliant on the social security system, you know, we have to make sure that those issues within that system are fixed. We have to ensure that, you know, things like local housing allowance is increased, because, you know, it has to begin to start covering private rents. And also we need to prevent homelessness at every turn. I mean, that to me is something that's really important. We have to look at evictions and, you know, putting, you know, the ban at the moment says 2 years, but, you know, we have to look at that broadly, because, you know, at the end of the day, we can all estimate the numbers of people that are potentially going to be out of work. If we think about London, unemployment could potentially hit 2 million. You know, a lot of you, I don't know who's on the call, but I'm guessing lots of you are quite young, so you won't remember what it was like, you know, 30 years ago. But that's huge. And if we think nationally, employment could even, you know, be double that, you know, that again is going to, you know, that's going to have knock-on effects on housing. And, you know, being able to live in a home is a human right. And we have to preserve that in whatever shape and context we can best do that as a party.
Would you support a cancellation of, if it was something that the Labour Party could actually work on making policy, would you support the cancellation of rent?
If it was something that we can work on and make a policy, of course I would. At the moment, I believe we'll just talk, we've said 2 years, but, you know, I'm absolutely open to that.
Nice. I think that's probably a good place to end on a slightly cheekier topic, but I really appreciate you guys. Sorry, I was kind of doing like some weird like journalistic rubbish there. I really appreciate you guys coming on to chat with us. It's been such an eye-opening panel, and thanks to everyone who's come to watch as well. Please do send Open Labour all the plugs that you mentioned today. We shall send those out. And yeah, has anyone got any final remarks they'd like to make? Or
well, can I just say can I thank you and thank the panel as well, both Heather and Deepa and Jake, and also Alex and all the Open Labour team for putting this together. It's great to have this conversation, and I think, you know, we could have probably gone on actually much longer than we already have. But, you know, I think we absolutely need to start thinking, and, you know, this is out to you guys on, you know, in Open Labour and the left overall, you know, how, you know, we're going to have to think about, you know, how we move forward from this, you know, and how are we going to stop those, you know, structural inequalities being exacerbated and, you know, really hitting, you know, our those protected groups, whether you're, you know, disabled, LGBTQ plus, a woman, you know, if you're BAME, but also, you know, think about the other groups outside of that as well. I mean, that is something that, you know, that's the biggest challenge for us, but we've got to do it. There's no choice really.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to say that we've got to be very careful, because the government and elements of the media will try and turn around and pretend that the inequalities that we're seeing in terms of death rates from BAME communities and other minorities are not to do with the poverty and the structural inequalities that are
I
in
think
our
we've got
system.
an audio issue there. Hold on.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I think you just cut out there for a brief moment.
Okay.
Would you mind
I
saying
hope I
that bit
didn't
again?
cut out at the most important point and sort of like sounded like I was saying something opposite to what I was trying to say. I was going to say that I think we've got to be very careful, because the government and the media will try and pretend in the months to come, actually the death rates are not to do with the social inequalities that are built into our system. And we've got to be very clear that they are, and that the effects are cumulative, as I say. You know, if you come in bad housing, then that's going to add to your likelihood of death. If you actually sort of like have been poor for a long period of time, your health will have been undermined for a long period of time. That will contribute to your likelihood of death, etc. So we really got to make sure that we keep that message and make it clear, and make it clear how poor the government have been over the last 10 years, but also how poor they've been at the crisis and what Labour would do differently.
Thank you.
Deepa?
I would just say that I think as the Labour Party, sometimes we're a little bit complacent about our feminist credentials, and we just assume that we're all very good feminists and that we're always incorporating these issues and thinking about them. But my experience is that we're really not, and there is so much work to be done still. And the other thing, I'm so glad to see that there is so much more organising going on in the party on BME issues. So many new groups popping up. There's just so much appetite to do on this and work on this, and obviously it's crying out for it. So that's really exciting, and I encourage everyone to get involved, and I definitely will do that too.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant.
And I'd just like to say a little last plug. Make sure you join Open Labour. We've been doing a lot of work on trying to just get people together and talking and like hearing each other's experiences, because that's what we need. You know, like we can't represent each other without us talking to each other.
Absolutely.
And this Tuesday we've got another event with Anisha and James Murray, who's the MP for Ealing North and was the former Deputy Mayor of Housing. So please make sure you come and see that. But otherwise, thank you so much to everyone. And yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great evening. Stay safe, everyone.